Good evening, everybody. My name is Reverend Bruce Beisner, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the first of what promises to be a series of very engaging and informative Tuesday nights here at Bay Area Unitarian Universalist Church. I was told this evening that this is the 17th year, we're pretty sure, that we have been doing this Great Decisions Foreign Policy series here at Bay Area Church. And we're very pleased to be co-sponsoring this program with our friends at the Clear Lake Islamic Center as well. And one of the reasons that this has been such an important part of what we do as a church is because it's really tied to our core values and who we are as religious people, as Unitarian Universalists. In the first couple of pages, in the gray hymnal that is in the bottom of the seat, probably right in front of you there is a listing of what we call our Unitarian Universalist principles. And the last of those principles says that we are called to respect the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part. And that is a statement for us as Unitarian Universalists. It means that a lot of times we interpret it as being about our connections and our relationship to the earth and our responsibility to take care of our planet. But it's really bigger than that, because it's the interdependent web of all life. It has to do with our relationships to everything that lives on this planet, including each other and other people. And, I really think if you boil down foreign policy, what is it about? It's about human relationships. And part of what this series always does for me is it helps me grow in my understandings of how complicated relationships are, both what the challenges and what the opportunities are, on a local level and on a much, much, much bigger level. And so, if this is your first time here with us tonight, if you have any trouble hearing me, we have listening assisted devices. You can go right up to the lobby there, and they will be happy to set you up with one. You just put it on your ear, and you'll be able to hear everything that's said through the microphones tonight. If at any point you're looking for the restroom, it's to the right as you exit the sanctuary doors and right down there. We also have a gender-neutral restroom, which is located in our office suite right by the front door where you came in. I hope that this evening and these coming Thursday discussions and these coming Tuesday nights are fruitful for you. I hope they open your life a little bit more to what's going on in our world. Thank you all for being here tonight. And it is my pleasure now to introduce one of the leaders of our speaker and events team and one of the main forces behind this Great Decisions program here at our church, Mr. Bob Handy. Come on up, Bob.
Thank you, Reverend Beisner, and thank all of you for being here and for braving the cold. At least this isn't Chicago. I don't think I'd want to be there right now. If this is our kickoff of our 2019 Great Decisions series. If you've not yet registered, or if you want more information about the program, see one of our team members in the foyer or in the alcove after the program is over, and they'll be happy to help you get more information and get you signed up. I can't begin to tell you how excited I am to introduce this evening's speaker. Dr. Hans Stockton is Interim Dean of the Division of Arts and Sciences and Director of the Center for International Studies at Houston's University of St. Thomas. My relationship with the center goes back more than 30 years to the arrival of the late William Cunningham, who assumed direction of the center following the death of its founder, Dr. Ann Teller, 35 years ago now? 1981. And by the way, this is Faye Alexander, our church pianist. Ann Teller is her mother, and she just had to come out because she's had a long relationship with the center as well. And I'm sure she's just excited as I am to have Dr. Stockton with us. I serve on the center's advisory board and as a member of the host committee of the Distinguished Diplomat Program, about which, as we go along through these next 8-9 weeks, you will hear more. They have some great speakers at the university, at the center. But enough about history. Let's talk about Dr. Stockton. He holds a Ph.D. in political science from Texas A&M University. His areas of academic specialization are democratization, elections, and security in contemporary Asia Pacific. He has published articles in journals of political science, economics, public administration, and Asian studies, authored multiple chapters in edited volumes on military affairs in the Asia Pacific and Taiwan's political development, and written 2 books on development and democratization in East Asia. He is a Center Associate of the Election Studies Center at National Chengchi University in Taipei. He has served as president of the American Association of Chinese Studies in 2015 and 2016, and coordinator of the Conference Group on Taiwan Studies from 2012 to 2014, and multiple terms as president of the Southwest Conference on Asian Studies. He served on the board of directors of the Houston-Taipei Society, Japan-America Society, and Asian American Heritage Association. And I could go on for another 10 minutes, but you're here to hear Dr. Stockton, not to hear me. So join me in welcoming Dr. Hans Stockton. I got to do this. Guan Yin.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to be here tonight. I had the great pleasure of talking to y'all. I shouldn't say I'm talking like an Aggie now. Talking to y'all. To speaking with y'all 3-4 years ago. It was about the more China-related matters. And so I'm happy to be here. I'm honored to be here for the kickoff lecture for this new season. And Bob, I appreciate the nice words there. I'm a social scientist, and I live in the world of theory. And the really neat thing about speaking with great decisions groups, I talk to the West U group quite a bit as well, is because of the policy orientation of the readings you have and that particular focus. I learn as much from you as hopefully I hope to convey to you. And that just a quick story about theory, which is what I'm going to talk about tonight, in relation to the readings you have for this year, but theory and reality. And so my family's been listening to me for years come home and talk about work, which is, of course, issues related to great power struggles and the U.S.-China trade war and this and democratization. And I didn't think any of my kids were paying attention or had any interest in what I was talking about until 2 weeks ago when my 8th grader announced at the kitchen table that she was running for class president at Pin Oak Middle School. And she looked at me and she says, "Well, Dad, you're supposed to be an expert on these things. Tell me how to win." And I said, "Look at the time." And so it has been actually a very interesting enterprise. And the thing is, I looked her right in the eyeballs, and I said, honestly, if you want to win, you always have to be true to yourself and do right by others. And it might not win the election, but it's what makes you a good person. And I think that's what we maybe lack a little bit in today's conversation of politics and even foreign policy. So I get the email from Chris and Bob. "Hey, Hans, would you please come out and give us a talk?" And the answer immediately, of course, yes. And Bob sent me the readings. And within minutes, I said, I know exactly what I'm going to do with this talk tonight. I'm going to try to find a way to identify patterns. I'm going to read these articles, and instead of reviewing the articles, which is what you guys are going to be doing over the next X number of months, is I'm going to try to talk about the articles more at 20,000 feet. I want to see if there's a historical perspective that might kind of lend to the conversation about very particular policy areas. I look for a variety of things, and I read all the 9 numbered articles. I was so proud of myself when I took copious notes. I'm going to create a framework, right, to help kind of consideration and discussion moving forward. And I get to the last article that wasn't numbered, and wouldn't you know what it says, right? American Foreign Policy in 2019, a framework for analysis. Apparently, Robert Hoffa has already done this for you. And I said, well, shoot, what do I do now? But as a social scientist, any scientist, right, we look at the world, we start looking at the world at paradigms really high up with a historical perspective and an understanding that time is not linear, especially for us historians and social scientists. Time in history and developments are more this rise and fall of things, and that what we think is gone comes back to us at some point. Samuel Huntington, I think it was Huntington, coined a term back in the early 90s called the errors of endism. And this was in his direct rebuttal to Francis Fukuyama's work on the end of history. And so I'm thinking of ways to create perspective so that we don't get lost in the weeds about these particular and very important policy areas, but always kind of return back to this idea of paradigm. And that individual actions of individual organizations or states, oddly, even though uncoordinated, show us patterns in human behavior over time that we are much poorer without seeing and noticing and being instructed by. So I went back to the framework and I looked for areas where I might be able to elaborate a little bit, not just kind of repeat. And then I thought, well, the second part of what I'd like to talk with y'all about would be other paradigms that I think would instruct or at least allow for hooks to attach various parts of your upcoming conversations on. Because at the end of the day, one of the areas that really drives me the most to actually enter the real world are notions of great power transition and the place of the United States in the international order, whether it's an order that's guided by the United States or an order that we are simply a future member of. These are the high-end kind of paradigmatic questions that I spend most of my time thinking about. So if we look at Hoffa's work, this framework that he provides is very instructive. It's a great starting point, and there are multiple pieces. Right, the first piece, well, he says we must look at the return of a great power confrontation. Read these articles in light of that. Questions about U.S. grand strategy and choice for policy instruments. The third is the state of the liberal international order, which intrigues me, as if it's written in stone and will be forever and ever, as if there could not be some other form of international order. The American foreign policy process, and of course, the return of great power competition. So the two bookends to his framework have also to do with these notions of great power competition. Did any of you guys ever read Paul Kennedy? I think it's Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, from the mid-ish 80s. Paul Kennedy, I have an uncle named Paul Kennedy. The author is also, I think, is not him. But Professor Kennedy was one of the first egghead social scientist historians to actually popularize and explain very well and so eloquently this notion of great power competition. But anyway, so Uncle Paul was a farmer in Kansas, and he pretty much knew how the world worked, and that was all there was. But anyway, so I was struck by Hoffa's focus, and so he begins with this notion of the great power confrontation, and it's almost assumed that that's kind of the starting point for his framework. You know, he cites various U.S. government documents. You can look in the DOE even. You can look at the Department of Defense. You can look at State Department. Sprinkled all throughout these is this notion that the central challenge to U.S. prosperity and security is the rise of a great power to challenge our supremacy, or what you guys studied last year with regard to Pax Americana. Okay? And of course, inevitably, the two powers that are noted, China and Russia. I think Russia is a distant second in that list. I think the primary challenger is the easy money there is, of course, China. And that pulls on a set of theories and paradigms called hegemonic transition theory, or great power transition theory. I want to return to that in the second part of my chat. And of course, we see countries in this great power competition using hard powers and soft powers and smart powers. And the next time someone wants to sell a new book, they'll come up with some other kind of power that we just haven't found a word for. And that it seems as if the competition is nipping, right? They're nipping at the margins. They're nipping at the periphery. They're not going for the center yet. They're not going for the target. And I'm reminded of, like, the dogs barking, but I'm also reminded of Sun Tzu's Art of War. Guys, ain't nothing new under the sun. Is another observation that struck me as I read these articles and I referenced the past works, is that we get so excited about what we see right now as being, oh my gosh, where did this come from? And it's brand new and we have to understand it. And we stop to really have a long-term perspective. And go, oh, you know what? The U.S. has faced these issues before. It was called the Cold War, right? And the great powers always face competition. And there are certain strategies to bring down a great power that are not unique to Russia or China today. You know, you can reference ancient kingdoms. So when you think of the great power competition part, please do pull up Sun Tzu's Ancient Art of War. It's not a long read, but I think you'll find that highly informative. But so this is old wine in a new bottle, right? My wife is, let's say, not terribly excited about the Trump administration. On election night, you would have thought, an A-bomb had gone off in downtown Houston. She was scaring the kids, right? And I had to go in there and go, it's okay, Mom's just a little upset. But there's this, I'll talk about her because I know that's a personal experience for me. And that she keeps saying, well, everything bad came about when Trump was elected. And of course, I have to, let's take a longer historical frame here. Now, we certainly find some interesting attributes and some policy decisions that are anywhere from offensive to disagreeable to, that was kind of surprisingly good. But again, to be so stuck in the moment to think that an individual like that at this point can determine the future history, right, of civilization or the world as we know it, I think we always need to have some perspective, right? Now, he could, but... So this old wine in a new bottle. Choice of policy instruments in the U.S. grand strategy. This is an interesting one. Hoffer gives us three choices of policy instruments. And he says, depending on your objective, right? He says some states want primacy or primacy, right? And that is for the U.S. leadership in the international order that we took on at least as of 1945 with the end of World War II, and of course naturally a little bit earlier than that. And so these are more adventurous ideas about war and invasion and occupation, the projection of hard force. Okay? There are those that argue for restraint. And of course, this is what Hoffer, the group that he calls neo-isolationists, right? These are the folks that say, bring it all back home. We've got hungry people in our own streets. Right? This is the best way to serve the national interest because those are our citizens. Right? The primacy folks say the best way to protect the national interest is to keep problems far away from us so that the core is protected. And then there's a third engagement or kind of approach he calls the selective engagement. And this is the middle way, right? This is a little bit of both. You get half the advantages of both, but you get half the disadvantages of both. And so when y'all have these conversations about, well, should the United States take the lead in cyber policy, right, or cyber espionage, international regulation, or trade, free trade, or whatever else, these are some interesting, again, frameworks to think about. The author mentions that every administration in the United States since 1989 has actually taken a selective engagement approach, or at least rhetorically. Right? We want to project our strength abroad, but we want to serve our citizens at home. This is actually a combination of things that keep us strong. We see a disruption in that with the current administration. So there are some departures from where we were. That also reminds me, as you read the articles, look for the temporal pivot points in the articles, right? So the last 20 years, much of what I've read says basically the world began after 9/11, right? The modern order we see is the post 9/11 world, right? And I was looking for that in these articles, but what I found was there were multiple points. Several of the articles really, that's their reference, is 9/11, right? So they use that post 9/11 reference, the language, the war on terror, et cetera, et cetera. But there's another article that says, actually, you know what, the age we live in didn't begin in 9/11, it began in 2010 with Stuxnet. Okay. There are other articles, computer virus, right, cyber warfare. There's a couple of articles that really look at the start of the world we live in now with the election of Donald Trump. Right? So mixed into the various policy discussions, again, in terms of 20,000 feet in paradigms, what's my reference point? Right? At what point in time did this thing begin? When did this thing become the problem it is? Right? So that's something I found kind of neat to look for. The third issue is kind of framework item is the state of the liberal international order. And this was actually, first off, I'm partial. I'll admit it. I am very partial to the liberal international order, warts and all, right? But I thought to myself, well, one of these days, it's quite likely there won't be a liberal international order. So that relates to primacy, restraint, and selective strategies of engagement in the world. What would that look like? And could the U.S. resist it? Would we find ourselves embracing somebody else's international order? And the question then that the author Hoffer asks is, are we as Americans, do we as Americans see our leadership of a not just an international order, but a liberal international order worth preserving? Can the U.S. protect our national interest if we do not also retain our primacy? But what if you're someone who favors restraint and a return to home and taking care of home hearths and things like that? Does that mean you're also then automatically giving up the notion that we as a country can lead an international order? So then I got to thinking of potential paradoxes and contradictions in how we read the articles, the things we think, but then can we identify where our own thinking starts bumping into each other in our own head to create those potential contradictions. Demands of state sovereignty. This is a neat one. So the author Hoffer says there's a tension between the international obligations of states to an international order, right, and the necessity of serving the national interest. And we see that now in the current conversation in the United States. But I'd argue the very success of the liberal international order in terms of the successes it's had with regard to spreading wealth, for example, the spread of democracies, the rise of labor unions where they were formerly banned, things that a variety of new ideas about governance and regulation that preserve a quality of life and actually allow human flourishing where it didn't exist before. Those are all the things that we should praise from the liberal international order, but at the same time, it's also empowering formerly quote-unquote third world states or the developing world or countries in the global south to finally stand up and say, you know what, we want to now exercise our sovereignty. Nobody's asked us what we thought the world should be like for the last 70 years. We didn't really have much influence. We hear a lot about China standing up. Xi Jinping, right, uses that language all the time. China has now to the point of standing up. Well, China's not the only country that's standing up. And look at why China's standing up. It's become wealthy. And it's brought, the Communist Party has taken, what do they tell us, 500 million people out of poverty. Why? Because they became more and more engaged in an international order that was constructed by the U.S. and our allies after World War II, at least after Mao Zedong passed, right? 1978-79 with the rise of Deng Xiaoping. So then we all go, well, wait a minute, the liberal international order is failing because all of these newly empowered states are actually trying to exercise their new autonomy and their new sovereignty. Well, you shouldn't be surprised. Congratulations, you were successful. Now they want a voice and a vote in what the new structure might look like. We were worried. Remember the 80s with the rise of Japan? Oh my goodness. Oh, the world was going to end. I remember going to a rodeo in Calcasieu Parish, Louisiana, and outside the stadium they had this old Nissan, and for $1 you could take 2 whacks at it with a sledgehammer. That line was a mile long. All right? So that kind of thing didn't just pop up in the last 2 years. It's been ever present. And so don't be surprised about this pushback against the liberal order, because what we're seeing is actually coming from its very success in some part. Resurgence of nationalism and populism, another kind of structural component the author wants us to be attentive to. And we see that. But you know what? We saw that in Europe in the 1980s. We saw it in Europe in the 1920s and 1930s. Again, this is old wine in new bottles. This is not a new phenomena created by fill in the blank in the year 2017. Hoffa writes, though, that resurgence of nationalism and populism go hand in hand with newly empowered state sovereignty as a rebirth of nationalism. So, I'd argue, though, that nationalism and populism actually precede progress in state sovereignty. So state sovereignty, the idea that the state is sovereign, right, within an international system, and it can or it can't do things depending on what its leaders and if it's a democracy, people want it to do. Nationalists and populists are really weird bedfellows, though. But theoretically, there are contradictions here. Right? So nationalists want to make the state strong vis-a-vis other states. Okay. Populists, however, want to make citizens strong vis-a-vis their own state, which, by the way, makes the state weak. Right? Anytime you see nationalism and populism coming together and talking together about making the state strong, Perón in Argentina in the 1970s. What are my other examples? The rise of rightist movements in Europe in the 1980s. Throughout Latin America in the 1970s with the rise of populist movements. It wasn't just Perón. And I'm pretty sure not a single one of those experiments worked out very well. So there's a weird combination happening there. There's also something else that's interesting in that nationalism and populism and the scapegoating that those tend to kind of thrive on normally take place during times of economic crisis, not periods of economic prosperity, right? Because that's how the scapegoating works, right? You have a target for the misery of your population. The fact that we see in the UK, right, the various weakenings of the European Union on the continent, within the United States, we see kind of these poppings up of nationalism and populism, the combination of the two, during a time of economic prosperity. I think the scientific term is it freaks me out. So another element to this, and that is what Hoffa sees as the fraying of alliances, American alliances in the world. And, I can tell you that our friends in South Korea and Japan and even Taiwan know far less about what the American policy is with regard to their futures in the United States as they used to. There's a lot of uncertainty. Old friends are fearful and old enemies are, I'd say, rather gleeful at the prospect of the weakening of these alliances. But at the same time, these alliance structures are changing, right? So Japan is still our ally. Taiwan is still our ally, or unofficially, et cetera, our friend. South Korea isn't going anywhere anytime soon. But the current administration has the Sino-Indo-Pacific strategy. That's now included a new group of potential allies, right? India, along the coastal areas up through Vietnam. And so there's actually prospects for folks that kept us at hand's length, who are either democratic or we see as the possibility of encouraging to take that liberal step. I think there's a new frontier there. What we are seeing when we think of this fraying of alliances, nobody's jumped ship, right? But there's this phenomena called bandwagoning and hedging that's taking place, to where the Japanese haven't jumped ship on us yet, but they sure are trying to cover their bases just in case things go south. The South Koreans are doing it as well in terms of economic relationships. Guess who's not the number one trading partner to those countries anymore? Us. Guess who is the number one trading partner? China. All right? And so what now you see is this weirdness that we absolutely didn't grow up with in the Cold War. And that is that Japan is our geopolitical or strategic ally, without a doubt. But they are not to the same intensity our economic ally that they would have been, say, back in the Cold War. And so an ally is actually morphing into, well, what are we talking about? Are we talking about trade? Are we talking about strategic forces? Are we talking about, And so it's a change. Does it mean it's a weakening? Left rhetorical. The process of making U.S. foreign policy, I won't get too much into that, other than there's a reference to the American president now actually as being increasingly unconstrained. Okay? But that didn't start with Trump. That process actually began as late as the late 1980s, after the Cold War, where Congress began to turn its attention to other things. American presidents weren't as wedded to the 50 years of treaties that protected the West from the East. And over time, the president's role and centrality in foreign policymaking has actually become much stronger than many thought it would be. But what the author worries about is what he calls a single mindset of concurrence, where we don't see this vibrant, open discussion and exchange of ideas and disagreements that then help us to the best policy decisions. He worries about that. And of course, public opinion, there's a bright note there, in that surveys apparently show us that the American public is actually more generally informed about politics, or foreign affairs, I should say, than in the past. The author fails to mention one very important kind of take on that, and that is, although Americans might be becoming more informed, we're becoming more informed from the same media sources, right? We only read the media sources that we know we already agree with, right? Not everybody. You guys, I'm sure you listen to 5 different radio stations and you read 5 different newspapers, but that is of great concern. And actually, I see it in my students. When I ask my students, what do you read for the news? And they'll tell me. And I say, what else do you read for the news? Because they'll give me the same left or the same right, just set of sources, and it never changes. I don't see, right? And I say, well, I'll tell you what, go home and listen to Hannity. And then tomorrow morning, turn on Pacifica Radio and listen to Amy Goodwin. Is that Pacifica? I think. Yeah, it is. All right. Democracy Now, right? Good, thank you. Right? Man, I heard her roast Bill Clinton one time on a show. That was crazy. But nevertheless, please expose yourself to various sources of information, especially the sources of information you disagree with. At dinner, I had a lovely dinner tonight. Thank you. Plato or Aristotle? Somebody help me out. The premise to kind of the overall view is that we're not really true philosophers until we can internalize both arguments, until we can understand why it is the person on the other side is making that argument and not discount them just because we disagree with them as a crazy loon. Right? Now, that never would have worked with my mom. But I'm a scholar. We get to talk about things that don't work all the time. Anyway, how much time do I have left, Bob? Do you know? All the time. All right, so understanding that y'all don't have day jobs, you don't have families to take care of, you got all the time in the world to read all the good brain food that there is out there. I want to make some recommendations that if you have the opportunity to take a peek at, because I think when we talk about this global challenge and great power competition, I think you'll be a better person for having this literature in your mind. How many of you have heard of the Thucydides Trap by Graham Allison? Right? Okay, a couple. Published in the 2017 piece in Foreign Policy. He's talking about hegemonic transition. Right? But that's kind of the retread. If you really want to understand hegemonic transition, there's an article by Robert Gilpin, published in 1988, called The Theory of Hegemonic War. And so just in a nutshell, 18th century till today, you'll see periods of time in which there are great wars, okay, and encompassing major wars. And those tend to be when a challenging state rises up to try to knock the current big guy off the pedestal, right? And what you'll see is actually periods of relative stability or calm in the world as far as wars go. And then there's a big spike as we get into one of the major wars in Europe, or the colonial wars over here, or World War I, World War II, the Cold War II. But then when it's resolved, we kind of go back to an even keel. It's not to say that everything is hunky-dory and people aren't being horrible to each other, which is an unfortunate trend. So there's these periods of relative calm, interrupted by major power conflict, back to periods of major calm, interrupted eventually by another major power conflict. So we've enjoyed 70 years without a major war. There was the Cold War, which is the first major power conflict, it's argued, that didn't result in an actual shooting war. Right? But is that the trend, or is that an outlier? And this is the question. Are we headed towards another hegemonic challenge from China, Russia, whoever it might be, and will that end peacefully or not? So there's Gilpin and the Thucydides Trap guys. 1989, Francis Fukuyama's End of History. Classic, man, and it still has currency. Right, so 89, the Cold War is ending. Fukuyama, in the national interest, publishes this piece called The End of History. It becomes his book, The End of History and the Last Man. And he makes this bold statement, and he says, the end of the Cold War tells us that, signals the unabashed victory of liberalism. It marks the end of ideological struggles that have given rise to the great wars and the great power struggles of the day, and that in the end of his book, he says that we are destined to become the museum keepers of human history. Man, with an ending like that, you got to read all the pages in betwixt. But so Fukuyama said that the big paradigm in the world to come was not going to be an ideological struggle between liberalism and something else. It was going to be about the cleaning up of the world in terms of scooping up those remaining illiberal pieces. And so you have the Fukuyama approach, and when you read your foreign policy frameworks. There's, of course, Huntington's Clash of Civilizations that first appeared in the 1993 publication in Foreign Affairs magazine, where he said, "Oh, those guys, they don't get it. That Fukuyama guy, he was my grad student. Right? I taught him everything." And actually, Huntington was Fukuyama's professor and was his most vocal opponent. It was kind of sad. They can make a movie about that stuff. So Huntington said, no. The end of the ideological struggle actually has removed what gave us structure, an artificial structure actually, for 50 years. When humans are now freed, or countries are now freed of the ideological kind of structure imposed upon them, they will begin to re-navigate or gravitate towards like-minded cultures. And that's where he gets the clash of civilizations. And he says that the Western states will kind of culminate together because of shared historical, philosophical, theological kind of traditions, and that China would become the pole of a Cynic or Confucian kind of configuration. And so he chopped the world up into 9 different civilizations. He gave Japan its own. He just didn't know where to put them. Right? And so there it was that the human family had nowhere else to aggregate to. We'd gone from fiefdoms and feudalism to the modern state to alliance structures to then civilizations. And he said, that's it. And it's paramount for the United States as the leader of that Western civilization to bring together that group in this new competition. Now, of course, that lends itself to certain kinds of thinking about xenophobic kind of ideas and things like that. But I can tell you that's certainly not where Trump is going. I mean, look at the relationship that he's kind of developed with our European allies. Things ain't going so well there. Trump doesn't look like a Fukuyama guy because I'm not quite sure what his values are that drive his ideology, or that liberal kind of thing. I don't know where that's coming. Is he a hegemonic guy? I don't care, just as long as the United States remains number one. He seems like the retrench type, right? The stay-at-home, kind of make America great again that way. The last one is Richard Haas, 2008, an article called "The Age of Non-Polarity," and I think Haas has kind of got something. And he says, "Man, I'm not going to give you fancy words. I'm not going to throw all this philosophical stuff at you. The basic kind of driving force behind human relations is power. And power is what gives the international system structure. There's the strong, there's the stronger, there's the weak. Right? The Athenians in the Melian dialogue in the Peloponnesian War said the strong do what the strong will do, the weak do what the weak must do. That's power. And that's been with us this whole time. And so what Haas says is, with the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the 21st century, the rise of these newly empowered developing world states, the relative decline of the United States, and it's an important part, relative decline of the United States vis-a-vis countries like China or elsewhere, are bringing about the end of a very important concept in international relations theory, and it's called polarity. The Cold War was the U.S. and the Soviets. It was a bipolar structure, right? In the 21st century, we're headed towards a multipolar world where the Chinese have their orbit, the European Union has its orbit, the U.S. has its orbit. You have Walmarts of the world that actually have their own orbit. So you have multinational corporations, states, interest groups, transnational, And for Haas, he says that's where the chaos is. Because ain't nobody in charge. Anyway, I'll stop right there. Just some stuff to think about. Thanks a bunch, guys.
All right, we've got Q&A time, and the emphasis is on the Q, questions, not speeches. I always have to remind everybody of that. You're the first.
I'd like to pose a question specifically about China, because they seem to have a lot of things going for them, and I just wanted to know, where do you think, what will be their influence in, say, the next 10 to 20 years?
All righty. Oh, you're recording this, aren't you, Bob? So there's a documented response. Okay. Well, I tell you this. One of your first stop is one of the readings. It's about the U.S.-China trade war and the nature and measurement of China's economy. One of the really neat things about reading that article, and I learned a great deal. I'm not an economist, and that is, when we think about what China can do, we try to speculate about what China can do, given what we think we know about its resources and its capabilities. There are any number of ways that we are overestimating China's actual capabilities. And so I challenge y'all when you read that article about China. So, for example, China's economy looks, well, it is massive, right? But it's not driven by sustainable factors. It's driven by an incredible amount of debt and public spending, right? China's growth rate this year dropped to, 6.5% published. Hey man, if the Chinese have actually publicized or published a growth rate of 6.5%, you know it's lower than that, right? Because they fudge those numbers all day long. You also learn from the article that inflation, they don't publish their inflation rate. It's considered a state secret, right? So we have to piece together all these mysteries and make assumptions about China's capability. I will say this. China will be a major player, and even more so in the South China Sea. The only thing that would reverse that is the United States finding an island of our own and building something really big and obnoxious on it. I don't see that happening anytime soon. China will continue to push for the reunification, quote unquote, with Taiwan. Right? The only thing in the blocking that is the American support for Taiwan, and the Chinese are becoming less and less patient with that. I guarantee you, within the next 3 years, there's going to have to be a major success or a major failure. But we can't keep stumbling along. Now, in 2 years, Taiwan has national elections as well. The current president is pro-independence, and it looks like she might actually lose. So 2 years from now, it looks like things will actually calm down, at least with regard to ruling party relations in Beijing and Taiwan. China is, I think, maxed out in Africa. I think that familiarity breeds contempt. Okay. Now, the corrupt autocrats who are inviting the Chinese in to build soccer stadiums and highways and power plants and high rises that no one will ever use, all right, are getting rich. But the people they're seeing Chinese colonialism or imperialism. Right? And that only, all the Chinese have to do is crack a history book from the West. Right? Patience with that doesn't last long. So militarily, they will continue to climb and informationalize is one of the clunky words they use. Their economy is, I don't see it as being sustainable at this rate. I did the math on this one year. Once, and that was I calculated based on the population growth rate, and I calculated how many jobs a year the Chinese have to create to employ the number of people that are entering working age, and I just called it 18 for yachts. It's a lot younger than that, and it is in the tens of millions. With a population that large, I think at one point, 40 million jobs, right, based on kind of the demographics. I know small companies that have a hard time managing a 3-person workforce, and these guys have. So I think in some areas I'm very concerned. In other areas, I think we've overestimated the capability. Sorry, I went on a little long on that one.
You use the term liberal international policy?
Order?
Yeah. Liberal international order. I translate that as promoting democracy and capitalism. Mm-hmm. Can you correct me if I'm wrong or expand a little bit on what you mean by that?
Sure. Yeah, in a nutshell, think of the idea of liberal, right, or liberty. Right? It is freedom to do, like freedom, and it includes elements of freedom from. Okay. And when we apply that to societies, we think in terms of marketplaces. Right? And so a liberal marketplace, literally is a free market economy, capitalism, right? So that the supply and demand and cost and quality and all that are, it's this interaction of producers and consumers, and the best thing kind of pops out, right? Democracy is a form of that. It's a liberal, open marketplace. But it's not products we're selling, it's ideas. And the currency is not dollar bills, the currency is my vote. Okay? And so, again, you have this scrum of ideas in the public space that are not supposed to be fettered by or overly fettered by, that's an Adam, I think Adam Smith liked that one. I love that word. Fettered by overregulation. So when we use that idea of international liberal order, that's where democracy and capitalism come in. This is the larger encompassing idea. But I will also be honest. I saw, was it Wolfowitz? It might have been Wolfowitz, IMF, during his stint. And he was asked, what makes the world go round? And I was expecting him to kind of put on his propagandist hat and say, job creation and capital and private property and human flourishing. His response was, debt. Debt makes the world go round. Well, but you can't put that on a bumper sticker. You can't sell an international, liberal international world order by, that. That's also what the international liberal order has been about. Right? It's been about leveraging debt to grow. And it crashes horribly, periodically. And it has not included all countries. And it's not included all people in all countries. And so those dissatisfactions and alienations and discontents from prior to the during the Industrial Revolution are alive and well today, despite the successes of that order. Now, I was told y'all are not a quiet group.
It seems like in a number of articles there's been discussion this last year and last few months about international wealth disparity. First we talked about just the United States, but now it looks like it's a worldwide thing where it's continuing at a pretty rapid rate of increase to diverge or get worse.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you see that affecting our future and what you've talked about tonight?
Man, yes, wealth. The inequitable distribution of wealth has gotten nothing but worse in the last 5 or 6 years. And if I remember my data right, in much of the world, that distribution had actually improved somewhat from the late 80s into right about the 21st century. So there is a period of time in which it improved. It's now being followed by somewhat of a retreat. Can one actually solve a problem like economic inequity? Do we satisfy ourselves and give in to say it has always been and will always ever be part of a society? Where it will go? I got a bunch of cash sitting in my Roth account that I'm scared to death to actually buy stock with. And you want me to predict the future of international wealth distribution? I'm gonna have to hesitate on that one. And if anyone has a good tip on the way out,
remember what business I'm in.
Yeah, I'll say this. Inequity creates disenfranchisement. Whether it's an ethnic group, a religious group, a socioeconomic class of people, a geographic group, anytime there's inequity, there's disenfranchisement. And it's disenfranchisement that gets people the pitchforks and the torches out, and the populists and the uber nationalists. Now, patriot, rock and roll, right? So there's a difference between being a patriot and being a nationalist. And so when you look historically, that's when the masses have risen up and hung the rest of us up by piano wire, right? And going back to what I mentioned in the early part is I'm seeing those trends, though, during a period of economic prosperity. But there are also chunks of our own society we went, huh? Where'd those guys come from? Their sense of alienation, generally, is the same kind of alienation that any other group of people would suffer. So if you give in to the notion of inequity and disenfranchisement, then you certainly can't be blind or deaf to whichever groups in your society suffer from that. I don't like the message sometimes, that's for sure.
Right.
What do you think of Europe going forward now? It looks like some kind of a disengagement with America now, and in that case, I would say that thinking of in terms of the liberal order, international order, and globalization, seems like that has sort of backfired, and Europe, it seems to me, is kind of in a much more turmoil than anywhere else.
Who was it? Rousseau? Oh, I'm going to make a liar out of myself. I think it was Rousseau who wrote about a world spirit. And basically his idea was that there is some phenomena, every now and then, because we're all human, we kind of end up on the same channel every now and then, and that the angst and anxieties brought about by globalization, displacement, alienation, are not just suffered by Americans, they're suffered by folks in Europe. And we're like, hey, are you seeing the same thing we're seeing? And we're like, yeah, is this happening over? And they're seeing that, right? And man, Angela Merkel keeping the European Union together, as Germany as being the leader. I mean, wow, what a job she's done. But she's on her way out. So I'm not all terribly optimistic about the EU, but it did grow phenomenally large. It's grown beyond the boundaries that they would have expected in the beginning. As long as the French and the Germans are at least together in whatever it ends up being called, and aren't fighting over the Alsace-Lorraine again, I think we're in a good place for starters.
We had some visitors from England this summer, and I said, "Well, what's up with Brexit?" And she goes, "Well, I don't like all these foreigners coming to my country." She didn't like all the immigration, and a lot of other nations. Can you speak on that? Can you speak on that as well, as far as the European Union, Germany, and so on?
Well, so when I made reference to Europe in the 1980s and the rise of nationalism mixed in with xenophobic, mixed in with anti-immigrant, so you had a time in Europe in the 80s, including the UK, like the UK was the leader on this with Thatcher, who was desocializing the British economy. Right? And the Germans were moving away from what they had been doing in terms of the expansive safety net and state intervention in the economy. And this was causing real transitional displacement and turbulence. And it created that group of folks that were feeling increasingly displaced and disempowered. And that is where we get the rise of what was called the New Right in Europe during the 1980s. So clearly, the Brexit, the European Union engagement and open borders and things like that have created much of the same tensions as the old structure. So again, old wine in a new bottle. And so look to see what happened in the 80s. How did governments diffuse the rise of right, largely fascist skinhead movements? How did they diffuse that? Did they have to wait for the economy to just get magically better and it would just went away? Now the economy's good. But here's the cool thing is when we look at countries and economies, we look at them at these unified, uniform things. And we always forget that countries are made up of sections and geographies and groups, and somebody's getting something and somebody's not at any given time. And I think that there are groups of those folks that simply hadn't become apparent, that because of the Brexit vote actually started to kind of come out and say, hey, you know what, I actually kind of support that.
Well, I was thinking that maybe just the migration in itself was the trigger.
Well, the open borders, and that's a function of the liberal international order, right? It's not just open borders to goods, it's open borders to services, it's open borders to movement. I mean, heck, it's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the freedom of movement. And we're actually starting to see that at a scale never seen before it because of the technology that actually allows it. Well, and now people are encountering that. Right? After decades of freer and freer movement, it's penetrated deeper and deeper into the hinterlands or the societies, and people are seeing that they don't like it. They're saying that they like it. Then that's, when it's exotic and far away, it's easy to be sympathetic. Well, in the 80s, right? The last one out of Detroit, Turn Off the Light, or whatever that's.
Yeah. I have a different type of question. Our debt is over $21 trillion, and it's primarily held by Saudi Arabia and China. What if they refuse to buy any more of our debt?
Oh, so don't forget the American people. You're talking about foreign owners of U.S. treasuries and things like that. Yeah. Well, so this is a constant boogeyman in the conversation about the what ifs with the U.S.-China situation. So the kind of the standard response is, well, you know what? If China wants to destroy its own economy, then selling all those treasuries would be the best way to do it. So it's like China holding a gun to the U.S., but at the same time doing this. Right? So it would be economic suicide because if they sold off those treasuries, they become, well, one, worthless. Two, you know what? You think a president like Trump might say, yeah, we're not going to honor those treasuries, those securities. It would be an incredible damage to the Chinese economy. But here's the deal: the Chinese historically can put up with a lot more pain and discomfort than we can in the U.S. And so, would Xi Jinping take that step? Not right now.
One other comment: if you take $1,000 bills and stack them up so it's $1 million, it's 6 inches high. That's $1 million is 6 inches. So if you multiply that by 1,000 to get $1 billion, it'll be the height of the Washington Monument. That's $1 billion. Now, a trillion is 1,000. It's 500,000 feet for 1 trillion, and we got 20 trillion. So you can start thinking big numbers in your head.
Yeah. No, I hear you, and I think it might be a little excessive. Well, let me throw this back at you, though. 1971, Richard Nixon takes the U.S. dollar off the gold standard, right? Closes the gold window. I tell you what, man, from that point on, it's all make-believe. I mean, seriously, it's all make-believe anyway. Now, I don't want to be dismissive, but when we went off the gold standard, I mean, we still act as if we're on a gold standard. Now, the debt can be good. Debt is bad. But I don't see the Chinese, for example, using our debt against us anytime soon.
Hans?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, guys.
Very, very
What a
good.
hoot.
Very good.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. Good. I enjoyed it immensely. And by the way, when I joke a little bit about questions, not speeches, I don't mean that to gag you. If you want to express an opinion, you're always free to do that. And I'm sure Hans would enjoy, pardon me if you don't mind my St. Hans. Chatting with you in the foyer. We have refreshments. Please help yourself, but let him get out there before you capture him up front. Now, some housekeeping things. If you haven't yet registered for Great Decisions and you want to participate, and by the way, I just saw Chris Ruby over here and was reminded she has had some exchanges recently with the Office of Secretary of State James Baker, talking to him about maybe coming down in the future, and he explains that he's 89 years old and he's really not doing that sort of thing anymore. But in the process, he praised the Great Decisions program, said it was one of the best public education programs in the country as it relates to foreign affairs. So be proud that you're participating. And as most of you know, I've been doing this for 51 years, so I'm sold on it. Anyway, if you want to register and you haven't yet, there'll be Diane Zachary will be in the alcove over here. She'll have booklets, she'll have registration forms. Feel free to go and see her. And then on Thursday at 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and 7 o'clock in Cockrell Hall, we'll have booklets and registration forms. If you weren't able to get your booklet tonight, now you don't have to come. That's orientation. If you've participated before, you already know what the drill is. You don't have to come. But if you want to register or get a booklet or just chit-chat, 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock, or 7 o'clock on Thursday. And I look forward to seeing those of you who come. Thank you very much for being here.